A billion here, a billion there, sooner or later it adds up to real money. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Back to our home turf, live from Stein Studios in Ratmalana, a new setup, a new theme. However, we're discussing about the same old problem facing Sri Lanka in today's day and age. What is it? It's the country's economy. Joining us this evening on the show are Raj Prabhu, Senior Research Analyst of Verity Research. Also joining us this evening on the show are Manjul De Silva, CEO, Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, as well as Indrajit Aponzu, Senior Lecturer, University of Colombo, as well as Director, eConsult Asia. Let's start off tonight's show with Raj Prabhu, Senior Research Analyst. Raj, interestingly, on Friday, there was the first Sri Lanka's Creators Online Forum that was held in Sri Lanka, and I'm pretty sure that you were also one of the participants who went and witnessed the live events that was unfolding from Colombo. What are your initial take with regard to the online creator forum that was held a few days back?
Okay. Thank you for having me on the show. So I think this was more of like an update to the creditors. And when dealing with our creditors, what I think is the most important is greater transparency and equal treatment. And opening this up to the public and having greater transparency on this creditor update was one of the key factors, and is a very important and appreciable step by the government. However, we know actions speak louder than words, and we are yet to see what the government intends or plans on doing. This was more of an update. We are yet to see what the government plans on achieving those targets. Some of the targets were mentioned, but we are yet to see what the plans are. However, this should not be considered as a one-off event. This should be considered as a first step in our debt restructuring process, and moving forward we expect to see greater transparency in that process as well.
Raj, interestingly, I was also privy to some of the information that was unveiled at this discussion that was chaired by the Governor of the Central Bank, Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe. Now, interestingly, he brings forth very optimistic targets. He speaks about real growth trajectory by the year 2025 at 2.6%. He speaks about a primary balance of 2.3% in 2025 as well. Now, this is the first time ever after many decades that Sri Lanka would record a surplus growth as far as the primary balance is concerned. I presume since 1960, Sri Lanka has only recorded positive balances maybe 5 or 6 times. And then he speaks about the inflation path to bring down from 48.2% to 5.9% by the year 2025, and the current account standing at minus 1.2%. These are very, very optimistic targets. Can these targets be achieved in the next few years?
That's an interesting point, and that's actually quite important. So the 2.3% target is something that was mentioned in the IMF staff level agreement as well. So these are targets by the IMF, and these are essential to make our debt sustainable. And these, like you said, are ambitious targets. Since 1960s, Sri Lanka has never had a primary surplus of around 2%. There were few instances where Sri Lanka had a small positive primary surplus, but Sri Lanka has never achieved it, never achieved more than 2%. And what's important is that regardless of primary surplus, Sri Lanka has a history of setting targets which are quite optimistic and never meeting them. For example, the revenue target set in the budget was almost never met since 2011, as far as I know. Sri Lanka has a history of setting optimistic targets and not achieving them, and this is something that comes back to the point of lack of analysis. So what we need to see here is what is the government planning on doing differently, or how the government plans on doing or achieving these targets of a primary surplus of 2.3% by 2025. We haven't seen a plan yet, and we are hoping we might see some indications in the annual budget coming in November. But we are yet to see what the government plans on doing differently. And even the governor has also acknowledged that these are quite ambitious targets at the creditor meeting. And these ambitious targets are required to make debt sustainable. But the problem is that, is this going to be as usual, where Sri Lanka sets optimistic targets and doesn't meet it? Or is Sri Lanka really having a plan or working on a plan to achieve those targets?
But ultimately, Raj, what is important is to understand how would the ISB bondholders view all these targets, because at the end of the day, it's their money at risk. So do you think that the ISB bondholders who were present at the meeting on Friday through the online platform will buy this argument from the Central Bank of Sri Lanka or even the Treasury Secretary?
So this is just a creditor update. Further engagement with the creditors would happen separately and by signing non-disclosure agreements as well. These were mentioned at the creditor update. So I think maybe when the non-disclosure agreements are shared, maybe they will show further details on the IMF program. But what's important is that these are targets that the IMF also agrees on. So IMF is considered rather than giving us money, IMF is considered as creating investor confidence. So once we get that board level agreement, it gives the signal that IMF also agrees that Sri Lanka has targets that it's working towards. And that signal, the confidence signal generation is quite important. And once we get the board level agreement is when we can see further intense debt restructuring negotiations.
So Raj, let me refresh your memory a little bit and go back to Friday where the meeting took place. The governor of the central bank, who was very optimistic about the IMF disbursement coming in by the end of this year, puts in a condition at the meeting. He says the IMF disbursement will be available before the end of 2022, but it depends on cooperation from the creditors and assurances that are made. So does that mean if there are no assurances by the creditors, Sri Lanka won't get the first IMF tranche, which the governor said that we would get it by the end of this year?
So in my view, the December timeline is the most optimistic we can have. And in addition to the financial assurances, which IMF has this condition where they do not lend to countries with unsustainable debt. That is why you need these financial assurances from creditors that they will help Sri Lanka make their debt sustainable. And that is the whole reason of financial assurances. In addition to that, the IMF would also want to see the annual budget to see what Sri Lanka plans on doing. So the December target is quite optimistic. A realistic target would be the first quarter of 2023 where we see the board level agreement, and the second and third quarter of 2023 where we get into debt restructuring negotiations.
But even the interim budget, Raj, that was presented by the Minister of Finance and the President of the country, Ranil Wickremesinghe, recently, a few weeks back, does not indicate any analytical view as to how we should proceed forward as far as Sri Lanka is concerned. Let's take a look at the tax structure for an example. This very same tax structure that we witnessed prior to 2019 after Gotabaya Rajapaksa took over office, everything changed. Now we are seeing the same path in which President Ranil Wickremesinghe is envisaging as far as the future is concerned. So there seems to be no analytical view so far, thus far, with regard to how we are proceeding forward. So as a senior research analyst at Vetri Research, how do you view all these developments that are taking place in Sri Lanka?
Yes, so the lack of analysis is something that we have put forward and we've asked for. Even with the 2019 tax cuts, there was very little analysis that was put forward, and we've continued to ask for if there are any analysis done behind it. And what we need to advocate for is data-driven analysis behind policy decisions. The reason why I think the government also is moving towards the 2019 tax structure is also the lack of analysis problem. For example, Vetri Research published a background note from the Vetri Research Economic Policy Group, where we said that instead of going back to the 2019 tax structure on withholding tax, so withholding tax was a tax on interest income, instead of going back to the 2019 tax structure of a 5% final payment on interest income, to have a 10% withholding tax as a prepayment, where the government is able to gain more revenue through the higher interest cost now, and the government is able to get a higher interest revenue through the tax structures. So what we are trying to advocate for is that you put analysis behind your policy decisions. In 2019, it would have made sense because interest rates were quite low, the economic climate was very different. Now the interest rates are skyrocketing and the interest cost to the government is quite high. So by having a 10% as a prepayment, this somewhat cushions the government to get more revenue to help the rising interest cost.
How much of money are we talking about with this 10% withholding tax? If that comes into effect, would that be in the range of approximately around 160 billion?
165 billion is what we could get potentially in 2023.
Right.
And also, just to give you numbers, we spend 50 billion on supporting the poor. So 150 billion withholding tax would mean that we can spend we can pay Samurdhi 3 times. So that's huge amounts that we're talking about, and easy revenue for the government as well.
Thank you very much, Raj Prabhu, Senior Research Analyst. I have, of course, have a lot of questions for you later on in the show as to how with a 10% withholding tax can the middle class in Sri Lanka really bear it, given the current cost of living. All that and more later on in the show. I now move on my attention to Manjul De Silva, CEO of Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. Thank you very much, Manjul, for joining us this evening on the show. Is the private sector in Sri Lanka happy with what is going on in the country at the moment? Are they somewhat okay with the current status quo to what was witnessed several months ago as far as Sri Lanka is concerned? The dilemma seems to be now receding. Your time starts now.
Thanks, Shamir. It's good to be back on this show after some time. So basically, I mean, the way we see the current situation is similar to, let's say, a patient who's going through a very serious medical condition, undergoing a course of treatment, which is going to take some time and which may also have some side effects. And that is something the private sector is beginning to understand because, you know, I mean, we have to realize that we are in a very, very grave crisis and we have to come out of this, right? And in order to do that, I mean, you have to go through some painful reforms, and the private sector pretty much understands that it has to bear a part of the brunt of that process. So I mean, some of the things that are happening, for example, like the higher taxes, I mean, we are going to see a round of tax increases very soon. Corporate income tax is likely to go up to 30%. Personal income taxes are going up to 32%, very likely.
Not very likely, these are going to be gazetted in a few days from now, effective 1st of October 2022.
Absolutely, yeah. And the VAT has been increased already. Cost reflective pricing has been introduced for fuel, for electricity. Interest rates are running high. I mean, all these are placing some burden or the other on the private sector, and it's becoming very difficult to operate profitably. But at the same time, I mean, informed people in the private sector understand that unless you go through this kind of a process, you're not going to see the light at the end of the tunnel. So as long as the government stays on this path and we quickly go through the reforms that are needed, I think we could hope for a better tomorrow. So until such time, we are willing to be patient and basically, you know,
bite the bullet.
Bite the bullet, yeah.
Biting the bullet, Manjula, seems to be very easy to say. When it's practically you need to engage with the process, it's very difficult. You spoke about some of the taxes that are going to be put upon the private sector beginning the 1st of October, but there is also taxes that have been introduced, like the VAT, for an example. Let's not forget about the interest rates that are going at 26 to 28% in majority of the banks right now. So the private sector right now is bleeding, isn't it?
It's going through a very difficult time, Shamir, as I explained. But then at the same time, also if you look back, say 2 or 3 months, I mean, we went through an even harder time, right? I mean, when one could not get adequate fuel, when like we had power cuts running for 8 to 10 hours a day, I mean, that was a much worse period. So compared to that, I mean, we can see some stability, right? I mean, even on the foreign exchange front, it's still difficult. It's still hard to get dollars to meet your import bills. But at least for certain essential supplies, I mean, today there are ways of getting access to at least, you know, some amount of dollar currency. I mean, it's easing somewhat relative to what we saw in the past. But of course, at the same time, the pressures of inflation,
right,
and the interest rates are piling up the pressure. But At the same time, I mean, there is a certain understanding within the private sector that the government in its current state cannot provide any concessions,
Right.
and we are not expecting that. I mean, and in fact, we ourselves recommended some of these steps to the government because we don't see any other way out of this situation, Shamir.
Right. So, Manjula, over the years, as a journalist for the last 20 years, the word or the term that I've heard right throughout from respective governments is the fact that the private sector is the engine of growth in any country, in any economy. And this was clearly articulated by the Ranil Wickremesinghe administration between 2001 to 2004. Then when Basil Rajapaksa was appointed as the Minister of Economic Development, we heard this very same sentiment being expressed. Then in 2015, there was a lot of emphasis given to the private sector by the Maithripala Sirisena and Ranil Wickremesinghe administration. And even now we see Ranil Wickremesinghe addressing private sector forums, explaining the fact that the private sector needs to pull up their socks and help the country's economy. How can they do it if they are bleeding, Manjula? How can they do it if they are going to be non-profitable in the future? Do you know that this year or the next financial year, when the results are coming out of the P&Ls of the private sector, many companies, they would be going at a negative? And how can they sustain a country's government if the company itself is going through a bad time, bad patch?
It is going to be challenging, no doubt, Shamir. And of course, I mean, these are the results of mistakes that have taken place over time, over a long period of time. I mean, we have paid lip service to this idea that the private sector should be the engine of growth, and you should support the private sector to play its role. But it has not really happened in that sense. In fact, I mean, had the government listened to the private sector, I would venture out to say that we would not be in the plight that we are today in.
Because I recollect, Manjula, I recollect when I interviewed several former chairmen of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, which is one of the supreme bodies of chambers in Sri Lanka, most of them said in January that we are going to face a problem of this sort. And the governor at that time, Ajit Niwad Kabra, did not take any heed to these private sector companies at the end of the day. And look at where we are. So are you trying to blame the former government or the former administration for their mismanagement? And that is why we are in this rut today.
Yeah, one could say to some extent that, I mean, they did not listen. And actually, when the COVID pandemic broke out in somewhere like March, April 2020, we came out and said, look, this is a time to reach out to the IMF because a lot of countries were doing that. And there were facilities available that we could have made use of at that time. And then also we pointed out at some point in time that we should start seriously thinking about restructuring our debt, because it was becoming very clear that at some point in time we are going to run into a default. But unfortunately, it was not sort of taken note of. And also even the tax cuts, that is not something the organized private sector ever requested, right? And when they did away with the PAYE system, the withholding tax system, we pointed out, I mean, that these are the simple, tried and tested methods of revenue generation, and not to give up these measures. But the government at the time did not listen. So I mean, to that extent, yes, I think one has to hold them responsible.
Look at what sheer arrogance does to a country, and it's very sad, Manjula, that we're in this state of affairs in the country at the moment. Thank you very much, Manjula De Silva, CEO of Ceylon Chamber of Commerce. I now move my attention to Indrajit Aponzo, Senior Lecturer, University of Colombo and Director of eConsult Asia. Indrajit, nice to have you on board.
My pleasure.
Tell me a little bit about the country's economy in your eyes. You teach students right now. You speak to students about an optimistic future, because right now we are witnessing a lot of brain drain happening in Sri Lanka. Professionals are leaving the country. If you speak to an accountant, the accountant is not going to be in the country. He's looking for outside options or outside alternatives. In a situation like that, as a university lecturer, what would you tell the future prospects of this island nation now?
I think it doesn't look very good. I mean, this is not something I said even when the crisis was taking place. For two reasons. One is we are in a crisis. We are on the edge of, well, rather, we are over the edge, and that has created a massive problem where we can't make choices. We just don't have choices. We exhausted any buffers we had, and we have been so ignorant and so indifferent for so many years, and then that brought us to this situation. The second situation is, which is something not the popular point of view, the narrative, the IMF panacea is going to get us out of this. I'm not too sure. The reason is, if you look at the way things are moving, as you were talking to Manjula, the prescriptions, the medicines are not going to make the patient better. It might help in certain situations, especially from the death point of view. But whether it is going to help us in the economic growth point of view, that's where people will have cash in their hands. That's where people will have hope. That's where people will find opportunities. I don't see that. And things are looking even more dire as we go along, not only from a Sri Lankan perspective, from a global perspective and its repercussions on us now. Look at what is happening in the US. Look at what is happening in UK now. Just a few days ago, as someone has said, look, UK looks very much like a developing country, and they probably have to go to the IMF. I think there is a recklessness across the world with regard to what is going on, and there's an indifference, sheer indifference as well. Now that is going to affect countries like us, which are not only in difficult situations, we have really gone into crisis, serious crisis, and that had never been our experience in historical terms. So it's very difficult for someone to understand and to explain, look, things are going to be looking better. We were looking at the forecast of, Shami, you're saying, okay, very optimistic, 2% growth rate in 2025. 2% growth rate 2025, optimistic? Are we kidding?
No, I am not.
What I'm trying to say.
I'm not saying it.
No, you're
the
not
governor of the central bank is saying, and I'm quoting the governor of the central bank.
So 2% economic growth, is it something that will make things different to people? Come on. I mean, even if you have 6%, 7% economic growth, that's where people will be out of this rut. But 2% economic growth in 2025, if you are forecasting that way, I think we must be prepared to have severe pain on the way.
No, but compared to the numbers in the let's take a look at the numbers. 2022, the central bank is projecting that we'll go at a negative 8.7% as far as our growth trajectory is concerned. In 2022, their primary balance is going to be a negative 4%, and they're projecting that to go up to around 2.3%. So given the fact that we are in this situation today and having an optimistic view in the future, you are someone, Indrajit, you've always been optimistic. I recollect the first time you came on the show this year with regard to when the country was somewhat going through rattles as far as the economy is concerned. You said to your fellow economists who were on the show, be optimistic. We don't have to go to the IMF. IMF is not going to be the savior. And you are even saying that today. But a lot of people are of the opinion that we have to go to the IMF. And probably we are in this situation today because of economists of your nature.
Well, we have two situations. One situation is we have a serious debt problem, which is a liability we have created to the rest of the world, and that has brought on us something that we can't manage, because we just can't survive in that context. Second point is, we have to have a growth in the economy to keep people at least on par with whatever they are earning, whatever the businesses they are doing. Now, what I see now is the emphasis is on the debt restructuring, and there is not emphasis on getting out of the issue from a sustainable basis. Let me tell you what I mean. If you look at historically in the Sri Lankan economy, the only time where Sri Lanka has been generating incomes, dollar incomes in a sustained and also in a committed way was during Mr. Ranasinghe Premadasa's time. What's the distinction? He was driving exports. He was madly driving exports. Now, since then, we had nobody who focused on this. And why are we in a debt crisis? We didn't have dollars. We spent far more than we earn, and we got used to it. And we got used to borrowing at cheap monies from abroad, and that spoiled us even further. Then on top of that, when we came to the point of where we have exhausted all the generous lending facilities, we went to the market, and market thought we are looking good, and they gave us money, and we hammered that. And just the point is, 2015 to 2019, we were working with IMF. What did we do? We borrowed 12.5 billion on the ISPs and accumulated 17.5 billion. Isn't that our problem now? That's our problem. It's not the total debt. It's the kind of debt that we created deliberately. Isn't the IMF, wasn't the IMF aware of that? They came to help us in 2015 and 2019. You mean to say that this whole debt problem fell from the sky? Are we that naive? No. This problem was there. The experts were there, but nobody took notice of it. All of a sudden, when we suddenly realized, look, we have to pay 6 billion 2022, then we panicked. I mean, is that the way we run economies? I think I don't think, Indrajit, you are very well savvy with the numbers. Do you know how much of debt we must pay by the year 2025? I don't have the figures right now. It's 27 billion. That's right. 27 billion dollars. You know why? You know why? When you borrow in the private markets, you have a heavy interest payment coming in as well. Unlike in previous. Do you know how much Sri Lanka should pay as debt overall? We have a, my guess is that's about 50 odd billion. How much? For dollar debts. How much? 50 odd billion. 52 billion. That's right. Okay. And the IS, but this is not Indrajit a problem between 2016 and 2019. No. I'm not saying this has been a problem right throughout Sri Lanka over the years. That's right. Okay, let me. But you're pointing the finger at a particular period saying that I'm not pointing. In 2015, 2019, we borrowed X amount of ISPs. Henceforth, we are in this mess today. But that is not. No. I think you're misinterpreting. A conclusion. No, that is what exactly you said. No, Samir. Let me explain to you. What I said was this. We had I said the only time where we had a serious look at our current account and the trade account was during Ranasinghe Premadasa's time, where we really looked at it from a very business point of view. From that point onwards, let me just take the figures. From 2000 to 2019, our business account, which let me put it in that way, imports and exports. Imports is what we consume, exports is what we earn in dollars. Remittances, tourism, those are sidelines. Forget about that. The difference is 84 billion cumulative. 84 billion cumulative from 2000 to 2019. And if you take 2015 to 2019, it's 43 billion. The cumulative trade deficit. Now, what I'm worried is, under the IMF now, as it has happened in 2015 to 2019, we never paid attention to earning dollars. We are fixing the current, we are fixing the budget deficit, we are fixing various other things, but we are letting the trade deficit to aggravate, and we let that happen. Just take the figures. If you go to central bank,
Right.
central bank statistics, you can see a steep curve coming from 2000 to 2022, 21. It's just dropping.
I have a lot of questions for you.
Yeah, sure.
Indrajit. I'll pose those questions to you when the show goes on, but let me quickly introduce a journalist this evening on the show. Though it's a new setup, new theme, the same old people on the show. So on my immediate right is Shehan Ranatunga, on my immediate left is Disal Kapuge. Let's start off with Disal. Shehan? Yes.
So I'd like to direct my question to you, Mr. Manjula. So speaking about the private sector in Sri Lanka, now like Shamir said, we expected the private sector to be the driving engine of our country. And also one of the main, I would say, the points or solutions, some would call, for this crisis, obviously earning more forex. So one thing we're looking at is investments. Some would say this is not the time for that. This is a time where people look away from the country. This crisis has come to a point where it's so bad that we can't look long term. We can't expect big investments to come into the country. Is this true? In your expert opinion, have we lost investor confidence in Sri Lanka?
Yes, Disal, I mean, to some extent, right now, if you look at the mood in the private sector, I mean, a lot of them are not really thinking of committing serious investments. One particular reason being, of course, the interest rates being at this level, right? And also, it's also when you're faced with this level of inflation, right, and an exchange rate of the magnitude, what we are seeing today, it becomes very difficult for a business to actually make a projection going forward and sort of plan an investment expecting a certain return at the end of the day. So that's really holding back investment, and also we saw in some of the surveys that we have been doing in recent times that the investor confidence has been dropping. So there is a concern there. But at the same time, I think it may be a good time to attract foreign investment, if possible, into the country, because there, at least, we have some advantages because of the depreciation of the currency. To somebody looking at Sri Lanka from overseas, may find some very attractive opportunities right now. So that.
But Manjula, that's a far-fetched dream, isn't it? You're saying that we are now in the process of attracting foreign investors to come into the country. Just recently, a few days back, the PUSL chairman said that after the 25th of next month, there will be prolonged power cuts. And then we heard the Minister of Power and Energy saying that the coal tender that was supposed to be signed was rejected. Now, who is responsible? And now you are saying here that this is time for us to attract foreign investors. How on earth can you do it in a situation like this? The government has to get its act together, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are risks, and some of these statements being made also from time to time, it's not helping the cause, and that's creating some confusion in the minds of investors and everybody alike. But the reality is, what I heard is that now they have made some arrangement to get the coal by using the existing suppliers, the previously contracted suppliers, to get down the coal, and they are taking some steps. We have been told.
So we are getting a lot of questions, Manjula, on our SMS line 0766565353. So we have a question for you from one of our viewers. Manjula said that the private sector is aware and willing to bite the bullet. Are you not speaking only for the larger, better organized and large entities? Can the smaller ones survive this at all? And if so, what plans are on to look out after that group? Not only the big boys in Colombo.
No, certainly. I mean, certainly we understand, and actually it is the SMEs who are going to really find it hardest, because always the larger corporates have some kind of a buffer to withstand this kind of a situation, right? I mean, they will have some reserves, they will have some capacity, but it's SME, I mean, who's so dependent on finance from the bank, even for their day-to-day working capital financing. I mean, they are facing the most difficult situation. But then at the same time, I mean, like I explained, I mean, there is no way out. So we are at the moment actually having a lot of awareness programs, a lot of programs to actually guide the SMEs on how they can kind of deal with this situation. I mean, because this is a time where people need to look at their business model and see is there some area that they can...
But the only way out for these companies, Manjula, is to close shop.
Not always, Shamir. I mean, we have found, I mean, there are people who have looked at things more innovatively in a different way, where some have gone digital, for example. I mean, some have shifted their attention from the domestic market to export markets. I mean, today there are new opportunities. Given our currency, we can be more competitive. So, of course, a lot of people, they need a little support, little guidance, bit of holding hands. So we are trying our best to do that. And if there are any SMEs actually who need that support, I would invite them to get in touch with us.
Also, Mr. Manjula, asking and more like adding on to my previous question, I would say most people in Sri Lanka are rightly afraid. People working for conglomerates, multinational companies that operate in Sri Lanka, they are rightly worried that these companies would pull out from the country because of the situation. Is there a likeliness of that, or do you think these massive multinational companies are actually functional in the country? Are they making profit? Would they stay?
Yeah, I mean, we have already seen a few companies pulling out, few companies announcing that they are withdrawing. So that is unfortunate, because I mean our appeal to the business community is to be patient, to understand the situation. Yes, we are going through a crisis. I mean, there's no question about it. But what we feel is that if we stay on the right path, if you follow the IMF process, if you go through the debt restructuring, there I would deviate from my friend Indrajit. I am more hopeful, more optimistic that if we stay on this path, that we will be able to get things moving, and that, okay, we may go through a painful period. I mean, absolutely, there is no doubt about it. But if we do it right, there are many examples of countries who have done it and come out, and we can do the same.
Manjula, why is that economists in the caliber of Indrajit are still saying that IMF is not the option?
I think that was a view taken by many, and those who were actually in charge of running the economy as well. So we gave them a chance. We waited to see, okay, was there any other option? But we did not see. I mean, we heard of homegrown solutions to so many different theories, but nothing worked.
Yeah,
right?
so let me interrupt you there.
I got to say something.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
You meant two important points. One is
no, let's answer this question first and then move on.
Right, okay.
So we waited. We heard the former governor of the central bank in his roadmap spoke about a homegrown solution, that we will find the required money to pay our ISP bondholders. We heard Basil Rajapaksa in his capacity as the finance minister talking about a homegrown solution to fund the country's economy, and none worked. Everything was quashed and thrown out of the window because those policies or programs didn't work for Sri Lanka.
You know, I think, you know, the issue with the previous regime, before Ranil Wickremesinghe came in, Gotabaya Rajapaksa's
Arrogance.
The point is, I think there is a lot of talk, there is very little action on the ground. This is a fundamental difference I see. You are mentioning, you are asking Manjula about how on earth the private sector is going to make any difference under the current circumstances, right? Of course, there is a bad economic scenario which is making things very painful to the private sector. That's one side. But there's another side which we have not tackled. Look at this, even this oil issue, power issue. Don't we look jokers? I mean, you know, we say we can't run the coal because we have got the wrong specification. I mean, how many times we are going through this kind of thing? This has made us look.
Are we responsible for it?
No, this is what
we are not responsible for it.
You are not.
Those who were appointed.
Absolutely,
are responsible.
that's exactly what I'm trying to say. I think the bureaucracy in this country and the politicians in this country so unbusinesslike.
No, my question was not that. You're just deviating from the question.
Right,
the question was very simple. We wanted a homegrown solution for years, since 2019. The governor of the central bank last year, that is Ajit Niwad Cabral, spoke about a roadmap to build country's foreign reserves, a homegrown solution. The finance minister then, Basil Rajapaksa, who's now not in the country, spoke about a homegrown solution as well. Now my question to you is, has those homegrown solutions worked for Sri Lanka?
You see, the problem with these...
isn't our last resort the IMF?
It's not the problem with the homegrown solution. It is just a talk show only. They were talking about it, but they have not done the work. Now, let me just... This is where
so they should be held accountable if that's the case.
Absolutely. They should be held accountable for just doing the talk shows. Now, this is where I find the model that this country should have adopted was Ranasinghe Premadasa model. He doesn't talk. He gets people to work. He gets people to deliver. We were talking about SMEs. You know, talk to SMEs. They are in dire strait. I mean, this is absolutely very, very true. I have been talking to several exporters as well. And they were telling me something like this. You know, whenever we want to import, now the dollar is 360, that's rubbish. That's not the way it works. They buy dollars at 450 from exporters. This is how the business works.
But do you know that's illegal?
No, whether it is illegal...
No, but do you know that's illegal?
No, the question is in whether...
They can't do that.
No.
Trading can only happen through a reputed bank. Correct me if I'm wrong, Manjula. Trading can only happen through a reputed bank in Sri Lanka. Exporters cannot offer US dollars to any other organization unless otherwise it is not the exchange rate stipulated by the Central Bank of Sri Lanka.
Okay, now I think, you know, now this is what the theory says. This is what the rules says. Now I'm getting it from horse's mouth. You know, I have been talking to exporters today as well.
But to be
honest,
I keep a ear to the ground, and I know exactly what is going on. In terms of exporters, there were times importers had to pay approximately around 390 rupees to 400 rupees.
Yeah.
I have not heard the story of 450 rupees because after Dr.
Which I heard today.
Dr. Nandalal Veerasinghe came into the post of the governor of the central bank, he has been able to very well manipulate the black market as far as the US dollars are concerned. So I must say that the governor of the central bank has done some good as far as to reduce the exchanges that are done
through the market.
Yeah, through the
I have no issue with that. What I'm trying to say is this.
No, but I can't let you come on a show like this.
No.
The public are viewing.
No.
Say something like $450. That's not.
No, let me explain now.
Unless otherwise you tell me the exporter.
No, I'm not.
No, that's what. Now, if you say something, it has to be substantiated.
It has to be substantiated.
I can't let you say whatever you want to say. Say $450.
No, wait. Now listen.
When the situation is not true.
No, Samir, let me explain what they told me about. I mean, when you come to businesses, now take for example, I didn't get into a lot of details of as to how it really works. Now, I'm not going to highlight the fact that, you know, something like this happened. But what I wanted to highlight was what you see on surface and what you see happening beneath. There are still differences. and there's still a big shortage of dollars as well. And as a result, so many things can happen, and I'm sure central bank has done a lot of work trying to prevent this curb market. But that said, look at what his remittances are doing. Remittances are half what it was. You know, remittance, something like from $4,000 billion to now it's about $2.2 billion, right? And so what does that mean? That means either these remittances are not coming to Sri Lanka, or they are still working.
I don't think you've been able to. Have you seen the worker remittances over the last few months?
It's been improving.
It has been improving.
Wait,
I'll get back to you in a minute. Let me give you some time to collect your thoughts in terms of the numbers, and I'll just move on to Raj until then. Raj, now we have a question from one of our viewers asking a question saying, although many say the economy is in a downward trend, restaurants and shopping complexes are full. Last week there was a street food festival that was well patronized in Colombo as well. So is the worst part of the economy viewed by the Colombo crowd, or even the urban areas for that matter?
So how I would look at the crisis is that, you know, you had a sharp decline, and then you are at the lowest point, and staying at the lowest point is also quite painful, and then there's the recovery of it. So I think the sharp decline is almost over, but even staying at the current path is quite painful. And the problem here is that, like, even though the urban folk and you see all these restaurants coming up, we still see inflation at record levels. And even the debt crisis is quite large. So we still haven't figured out debt restructuring negotiations, and because of that we need to restrict imports. So at a higher level there are problems, but I think the problem here, what we're seeing is that even at the food festival, the prices of foods were quite high. But what we notice is that we've entered into this thing called the wage price spiral, where when inflation goes up, many companies increase your wages, and when wages go up, the inflation goes up again. So we've entered into that wage price spiral, and I think that is one reason why we see prices going up, but the real wages, according to central bank numbers,
most of the private sector companies right now have not increased wages of employees in a systematic manner, because at the end of the day, right now what the private sector is doing, Manjula can probably answer that question as well, they're tightening their belts because right now the future seems to be very bleak. I come also from a private sector company handling exports, so I know that right now the ethos of the company is to ensure that we tighten our belts and save some money up for a rainy day.
True, and that's what I was going to say, where real wages have actually fallen, and central bank numbers tell you that real wages are negative at this point, where people are not able to afford. So like there is a crisis, and especially if you go into rural areas, you will find this a lot prevalent. But I think the urban folk are able to survive currently.
So Manjula, so one of a viewer has posed a question from you, Raj. Manjula mentioned about taxes. Won't high taxes contribute to inflation, though it contributes to government revenue? Also, high interest rates impact high cost of finances, especially to small and medium enterprises, which is an important segment of private sector. What are your thoughts?
So I'll answer the tax question first. It depends on where you tax. If you're going to tax VAT, there's definitely going to have inflationary impacts because prices of goods increase. But if you're going to tax like personal income tax, your income falls, you're unable to work, you're unable to spend as you used to, that means inflation would reduce. So it's a question of where you're taxing and how you're taxing as well. So like depending on the threshold, so because there's high inflation now, you can increase the tax-free threshold, and that is where I come again to what I mentioned earlier. The analysis is important. You need to have data-driven analysis to see what threshold is it safe, because when you look at the poverty line, it has grown by 60% from 2021 to now. So the poverty line is around 13,000 rupees. So we need to adjust the tax structure and the tax-free threshold to that. So going back to 2019 is not going to work. So that's where you see how are you taxing, and based on the taxes you can control inflation. With interest rates, again, like I mentioned earlier, one way to counter that is where you have withholding tax to help cushion the higher cost. Because when you have the reason why there's high interest rate is the government doesn't have revenue but has expenditure. So one way of meeting it is through the revenue taxes. The other way of meeting it is through debt. And now we don't have access to foreign financing, so we need to rely on domestic financing, which is why Sri Lanka needs domestic sources, and that's why interest rates are quite high. So when you are able to collect more revenue through taxes, your need for domestic financing reduces. This is a bit long term. But
the problem is,
yes.
Raj, the problem is right now, let's look at the taxes that have been imposed. There is a 30% tax on income.
Yes.
From the private sector. So whatever that the money that they're earning after EBITDA levels, that is earnings before tax and tax, it's going to be depleted because the interest rates or the interest costs have gone up to around 28%, which stood at approximately around 7 to 11% pre-April, right? So whatever budgets that they forecasted before is now going to go haywire because the numbers would not be a proper reflection for the next financial year results. So whatever they are earning, they have to pay 30% on top of that as well, which is not budgeted. So who are they going to tax at the end of the day? It's going to be the general public. And that's how the cookie is going to crumble in the next few months.
Yes, so
and that will not lead to inflation coming down, would it?
So that depends on how we go about it. So if we are yet to see the analysis. We've known what the tax changes are, but we need to see if there's any analysis behind it. How are we going to protect the poor, and how are we going to protect the private sector? Because what we see now is a bunch of proposals that was announced in May, and that's going to be implemented in October. And without seeing the analysis from the governments, and it's hard to comment on what the government plans on doing. And one way of seeing that is maybe the annual budget would have some sort of cushioning measures. So we are yet to see those analyses by the government.
So there's another question posed to you, and then I'll come back to Manjula with regard to export earnings and so on and so forth, and then to Indrajit as well from the point where we stopped. So Raj, why is that the private sector and their employees have to bear the burden of the mismanagement and suffer more tax cuts, whereas the government servants don't face any of these, and more so the politicians? Why can't they too be taxed due to this critical situation?
So that is a policy decision, and it's not something new. And like there are countries, certainly developed nations, where the government servants are also taxed. But that is a policy decision that needs to come in through the government policies as well. And when you look at central bank numbers, the public sector real wages are way lower than the private sector wages. So it's known fact that the government officials are not paid as much as private sector as well, but that does not give an excuse. So what we need to mainly do is to hold executives accountable for it, like to hold the governors, to the parliamentarians, to politicians for their inactions. But to hold people accountable, we need proper analysis. Just to give you numbers, there are budget numbers that give you revenue proposals. For example, the Social Security Contribution Levy was set to contribute 140 billion in terms of money. That was never even implemented. It was very recently passed in the Committee of Public Finance. But how did the number come? We don't see the analysis behind it. So without seeing the analysis behind it, it's very hard to hold people accountable for.
So are you trying to say the government is yet again cooking numbers and trying to bring in revenue targets to ensure that they look good on paper?
The previous budgets prove that. So we are yet to see. That's what we've been advocating for. And the problem is that even Verity has published budget reports. So right after the budget, we do budget reports, and we were close to predicting the government revenue than the government in itself. So what we need to see is that either there is something wrong with the analysis, or there is no analysis at all. So there is no transparency.
Let me ask you a very general question, Raj. At the beginning of the show, I happened to ask your age, and I'm going to unveil it to the general public as well who are watching the show. You're just 21 years old. Did a local degree in Sri Lanka. What motivates you to stay in the country when the situation is so bleak? Because Indrajit started off saying the situation is not so good. What motivates you to stay in Sri Lanka?
So just to correct you there, I did my degree is from the University of London. So it's a foreign degree in Sri Lanka.
Yeah,
but what
you studied at?
I studied in Sri Lanka throughout.
Academic Institute.
Yes, and I feel what motivates me to stay is that there is a lot to learn. And also I feel like Sri Lanka is a great place. It's just that there are policy decisions that don't have proper analysis behind it. There's a lot to do, and there's a lot of potential in Sri Lanka. And I don't see myself personally going abroad or settling there. I like the country that I'm in.
For those people who are going overseas, who does not want to grind their teeth as far as the country's economy is concerned, or even politicians, Raj, what is the message you have for them?
So the message I have for them is I understand their point of view, and a lot of my colleagues have also gone abroad. Some of them have gone for higher education and planning on coming back. Some of them have migrated. So like you said, there is a brain drain that we see. And the only way to rectify it is to correct your policy decisions and make Sri Lanka, to quote Trump, make Sri Lanka better again. But what the messages I have for the people leaving is that always Sri Lanka is your home country. And wherever you go, Sri Lanka is still your home. And I still have that feeling towards the country.
When you want to make Sri Lanka better again, Raj, don't you think it's important to hold people who are accountable to this economic mess that we are in?
Yes, it certainly is, and that's one thing that we are working at Wait as well. We hold executives accountable, and it's very important to hold executives accountable for. But to hold people accountable, like I said earlier, you need analysis and transparency as well. So what is going inside the government? What are the analyses being published? There might be internal analysis done or internal number crunching done before they put the numbers out. It will be good and great to have that numbers out so that there can be like public debate over it.
So Raj, even on Friday, our attention was more or less focused on restructuring our international debt, foreign debt, and so on and so forth. But little are we focusing on the local debt aspect of it. We have a tremendous amount of debt that needs to be addressed and sorted out, and people have heavily invested on treasury bills at the moment. So what is the predicament in terms of the local debt that we have on our plate right now?
So domestic debt restructuring is something that has been talked about for quite some time. And what we are yet to see, and what the governor has also said, was the governor used to say that we are only looking at external debt, but at the recent update he said that we are still considering domestic debt restructuring. Nothing has been finalized. It's still on the table. And Verite itself is doing our own analysis on domestic debt restructuring, because dealing with domestic debt is quite serious and it needs to be dealt with quite technically, because there is a great impact to the financial sector. There's also a significant impact to the Employee Provident Fund, EPF, which holds significant treasury bills and bonds. But like you said earlier, most of Sri Lanka's interest cost goes to pay domestic debt interest, and also there's a high volume of domestic debt. So nothing should be off the table until we see analysis behind.
So Raj, the general notion, when we interviewed the governor of the central bank a few weeks ago, I in fact posed this question to him, asking whether or not attention has been focusing on taking a haircut maybe on domestic debt, and the answer was no, they have not even thought about it as yet. But he did not give a timeline specifically, because his answer was revolving around the yet aspect of it, that they have not decided yet to restructure the domestic debt. Is it because we can always print money and give out and pay interest rates for these local debts that we're talking about, domestic debt that we're talking about? Is that why even the central bank is not focusing too much on the domestic debt aspect of it?
So that used to be the strategy that the government used to do, but what it is, it's not a long-term strategy.
Yeah, because that leads to inflation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And getting into an IMF program, this is something that the IMF also has highlighted.
So what do you think about, as a 21-year-old, to what Indrajit said about not going to the IMF?
Not going to the IMF, I would like to clarify a few things. IMF is not a bailout. A bailout is only if someone comes in and says, I'm going to repay all of your debt. So that is a bailout. Or if someone offers to restructure your debt. IMF is doing neither. And we have agreed to a $2.9 billion program for 4 years. You divide that by 4, you get $725 million a year. Pre-2019, we needed 600 million for fuel.
Peanuts,
yes.
Peanuts.
So the money is not the point. And IMF is not going to bail out. There's a lot on the government and Sri Lanka to restructure its debt. IMF is purely a signal measure.
Right.
Yes.
Interrupt you there. Indrajit, what do you have to say about that? IMF is not about bailing us out, it's about engagement, because when the IMF is there, the international creditors will have some sort of confidence on the country, and that is the way forward. Because if you look at the 2.9 billion divided by 4, approximately around 725 million.
Okay, I put the question in this way. You see, now.
Unfortunately, today I'm not the one who has to answer your question.
No,
so.
wait.
The
point is
the
this.
panel, fortunately.
Are we not looking back to the financial markets as a borrowing opportunity? Isn't that what we are talking about here as well? Isn't that what we have got ourselves into now?
But how? Right. Let's say we buy your argument, or we buy your argument for a minute for the moment. Tell me, how are we supposed to pay 27 billion US dollars in the next few years if we don't borrow? Tell me.
Okay. The answer lies here. Now,
don't tell me sustainable solutions, please.
Huh?
Don't tell me sustainable solutions.
Okay.
Yeah. Tell me a pragmatic answer.
There are a number of ways that. Now, one way is going to the financial markets. And
that is borrowing. That is borrowing.
That is borrowing.
That is the definition of borrowing.
No, the point is this. The point is you got to have a parallel program at least for this country, so that we will.
What sort of parallel program?
The program.
How to pay $27 billion if not for borrowing? Tell me.
So you mean to say that we go on borrowing and pay the interest and let that snowball, and we get into a situation where we are basically living on borrowings? Is that what we are talking about? Now, my problem is this. Is it a solution?
Now, let's take a look at India now. You're a very learned lecturer. When the economy crashed in India in the early 1990s, Dr. Manmohan Singh was the savior of the country's economy. And there was nothing in the coffers as far as India was concerned at that time. Today, India accounts to 522 billion US dollars. And how do they do it? Through an IMF bailout plan.
No.
And isn't that what Sri Lanka also wants at the end of the day?
IMF bailout should give you a interface.
And that is what exactly people that is what exactly people like
the point is this.
Get the interface right.
No, wait. Now then, in which case, we should have had that interface when the IMF was here previously. We didn't do that. So having the interface is not going to give you the solution. You got to have a right strategy.
But in many countries, Sri Lanka has only gone to the IMF 16 times.
No,
there are countries that has gone to the IMF many times. I'll tell you a classic example. Let's look at Belize for an example, a country. They went to the IMF. How? Why? They wanted to go to the IMF to make sure if they are engaged with the IMF. They did not even want the bailout. They wanted just an engagement, because they know through an engagement, it will build confidence. Why are we shying away from the IMF? Is the IMF poison?
No. I think this is a wrong narrative.
It's not the wrong narrative.
No, it's like
trying to make it wrong.
No, I think the point is this. The IMF is there to help countries, all right. Now, that's the whole purpose of IMF, when countries are in financial difficulties. That was created to help them.
And that is why it's there. That is why you
But the point is this. But I'll tell you the reason. The reason why there is a lot of apathy towards IMF is IMF has a focus on financial markets. And every country that has come out of crisis is not through financial markets. They have come out of crisis through a progressive export drive. Every country, even India. India is what is now is not because of IMF. It is because they used they have created a strategy to create dollars, earn dollars. Unless we really have a drive to earn dollars, we will never be able to get out of this. This is my pessimism. The current focus is not there. Current focus
this is not what I said. This is what Minister Ali Sabri, the current Minister of Finance.
He's not an economist.
No, he's not an economist. But he spoke in Parliament. At least he knows something or two about the country's economy. he said that we were pressurizing the previous government. Why aren't they going to the IMF? Now, this was a sitting cabinet minister of that government, of that cabinet. When he says that they asked or demanded the previous government to go to the IMF to get some help, they didn't do so. And individuals of your caliber in this, I must tell you, are individuals, a very minority, who oppose this view. And this minority, fortunately, we can at least net you. There are others who you can't even net. It's like trying to find people who voted for the previous government. At least I'm glad that you're still in the same stand.
No, the point is this. I mean, this is a kind of a narrative that has been sort of got us to believe in. The whole country is now believing. I'm not against IMF or anything. What I'm trying to say is, if you are talking to the IMF, I think we've got to have our strategy as well to say that this is our strategy. We don't have a strategy. We are bankrupt to the extent we are wholesale taking the IMF prescription. And the point is, now this is where mark these words. Point is, if the IMF prescriptions did work for Sri Lanka, I think we should have salvaged this situation between 2015 and 2019. No, it didn't happen. And in fact, it got worse. Where did it?
Why are you talking about 2015, 2019?
No, the point is this.
So that's that government.
No, it's not this government or that government. I'm just looking at the statistics.
No, because you're not talking about 2019 post.
No, that's even worse.
That's even worse.
That's even worse.
Okay, very good.
That's even worse because they mismanaged administratively.
Right.
They mismanaged strategically.
Right.
They gave a lot of hope to people. Look, we are doing the right thing, but they didn't do it. They were just talking. It's a talk show. Mr. President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, when he started off, he said, look, I'm a no-nonsense guy. I mean, I thought, oh, then he is a kind of a hybrid of Ranasinghe Premadasa and the modernization. I mean, people.
Let's leave it at that.
No. I'm not saying.
Okay.
That's the kind of the hopelessness they created.
Okay.
And as a result, it's not the framework. It is the way they managed it was so bad.
No,
and there were a lot of people like previous governor. They were just talking rubbish, honestly, and not having any substantive strategies to make it happen.
Who was talking rubbish in this?
Yeah, the previous guys.
The former governor of the central bank.
Yeah.
Ajit Nivat Kabra.
No.
Okay. Manjula, there's a question for you from one of our viewers. What is the central bank doing with regard to obtaining the foreign currency that have been stashed away by major exporters? Because this was one of the topics that was spoken about in Parliament as well. Not a very popular minister, but he spoke about how exporters are not bringing in money, how exporters are not paying the required amount of taxes to the country, and henceforth taxes need to be incorporated, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, Shamir. So this concern has been there for some time. You know, I mean, people were questioning as to why, like, you know, because we saw export income doing pretty well. I mean, we were generating something like at least $1 billion a month. In some months, it was more. But the amount of cash in dollars that was really flowing into the country was nowhere near that figure.
Yeah.
Of course, there are some reasons for that. I mean, partly, like, for instance, some of our exports are heavily dependent on imported inputs like apparel, right? So there is a considerable amount of outflow also going in to get the necessary inputs. But there are other areas like tea or rubber, for example, where the value addition is high and one would expect more earnings to come in. So basically, I think we also accept the fact that there appears to be a gap in also areas like IT, for example, right? The reported earnings and what was actually coming into the country. So the central bank also began to monitor this a little more closely in recent times, and actually that explains to some extent why the dollar liquidity has improved in the last few months. Because people are asking how come suddenly, okay, yes, we stopped the debt payment, so that is one thing that helped, but at the same time, the tightening of the monitoring has also made sure that more of the proceeds are coming. And in fact, from the Ceylon chamber, I would like to tell you here in public today that we made an offer to the central bank that we will carry out an audit at our expense, because we want to make sure that the private sector is playing by the rules and the private sector is doing what it is supposed to be doing.
On that note, Mr. Manjula,
in fact, at the moment we are in talks with the central bank to get that
very quickly, Vishal, if you don't mind, please. I just want to quickly pose a question to Manjula with regard to the export earnings. The export earnings are hovering between 1 billion and 1.2 billion US dollars every year. If you look at our Sri Lanka's import bill, it stands approximately around 1.5 to 1.6 billion monthly. So if you really look at these numbers, the only disparity that we're talking about is approximately around 300 to 400 million US dollars. So that can be supplemented very well with worker remittances and tourism arrivals to Sri Lanka. So the biggest question that begs an answer here is the fact that why isn't this 1.1 billion US dollars brought in as cash to the country?
Yeah, so that's exactly what I was telling you about. So there was this concern, okay, there has to be some allowance made for the import of inputs. I mean, there are also certain payments. I mean, some of them have taken foreign debt, so that debt has to be serviced, and these are permissible outflows, which the central bank.
So let's leave aside 200 million for that.
Still there is a gap.
Let's say we have around 1 billion. So that 1 billion has to be brought into the country by the private sector. So from that 1 billion, if the import bill is 1.5 billion, we're only talking about a 500 million disparity. So that 500 million disparity can be brought in by the 300 or 400 million US dollars that we get from the worker remittances, and another additional 100 million could be brought in by the tourism arrivals, because now we are not paying debt. So this could be very well supplemented, isn't it?
Yeah, you're right. Of course, I mean, some of these numbers have improved in recent times. I mean, there's nothing coming from tourism a couple of months back, and then even remittances.
But now things are improving.
Yeah, now things are improving.
Are standing at approximately 300, 400 million US dollars.
But still, there is an unexplainable gap, which I agree. So that is a very recent.
So exporters are stashing their dollars away. Is that what you're trying to say?
I wouldn't come to that conclusion. I would say that yes, there is a question mark, right? So without really doing a proper study, I don't think one could really arrive at a conclusion. So that's where
question mark is very suspicious, Manjula. That question mark is you can't put it under the mat and think, okay, everything is hunky-dory, we are on the right track. That question mark is suspicious.
We have been checking, actually when we checked with all the associations.
So with regard to this audit that you all proposed, how is that process going to work out?
So what we have told the central bank is that we will engage an auditor, a private leading audit firm at our expense, because for the central bank to do that, you know, they'll have to go through their own procurement processes, etc. I mean, they will have a funding requirement. We said, okay, we will bear the cost, right? We'll get this off the ground, because we want to make sure that the private sector is doing the right thing, that you know, we respond to these kind of questions that are being raised.
Yeah, Mr. Manjula, I'd like to ask you, when we talk about earning foreign dollars and also about the export market in the country. Now, obviously, like Mr. Indrajit said, the export market is a key driver in us overcoming this crisis in some way or the other. So we look at the IT industry, like you said. It could be actually one of the industries, if properly developed, that brings a lot of dollars into the country. And we also have the technical expertise required. We have the people in the country, especially young people, who are learning this stuff, and they're actually in a competitive level in the IT industry. But then with the restriction of imports, a lot of, especially electronics, have been severely restricted under the current policies by the CBSL. So now we see most industries have come to a standstill because they don't have the goods. So to most people, it would look counterintuitive to take a policy decision like this to restrict imports to this degree. What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, Vishal, it's like, I mean, okay, we have to understand that imports have to be restricted given the, foreign exchange limitation, but at the same time, in selecting the so-called non-essential imports, at times I think they have selected the wrong products as well. I mean, certain items which are like key
So
inputs.
again, the government hasn't done their research properly.
Yeah, I mean, at times this does happen. But then, of course, in fairness to the government, I mean, when we point out that these are the essential inputs, that these need to be permitted. In fact, now very recently, you would have seen there was a second gazette that was announced, and with that, actually, quite a few products were released back again. Because there were some very important items of machinery, for example, certain key ingredients. Even at the moment, there are still a few more.
But then also, Mr. Mansur, like speaking about the Sri Lankan context, what we see is these big companies, these big corporates, big multinational companies, and especially like we were talking about companies that might have stashed their money away. They find loopholes in the system to somehow bring down the imports that they require. But then if you don't have influence like these big companies do, most SMEs and small scale enterprises don't have the means or the influence per se, to be very frank, to bring down these imports. Now that creates an inequality in the market.
So you're hitting the nail on the head.
Yeah.
This is exactly the problem. We don't have a focus for production. You go to all the supermarket, big electronic companies, and I mean they do have their various products coming in. I was just wondering how do they do this?
This is because Indrajit, during up until April this year, there were no import restrictions that took place because the then central bank governor did not have the vision for Sri Lanka. All the companies who knew, the private sector companies who knew things are going to unfold in a very bad way in the next few months in Sri Lanka, brought in ample amount of machinery to sell to the local market in the country. That is why in the last one or 2 months, the LCs that were expiring need to be paid. They need to be honored, and that is why from the 1,500, 1,100 million US dollars that we're talking about that was supposed to come, were not being able to pay. But again, as I said before, this is not an opportunity for me, because we spoke to the governor of the central bank a few weeks ago, and these are the sentiments that was expressed by the governor of the central bank. And I'm expressing that to you in the gym because probably you were not privy to that information. Because we did not have an import control up until April, people were bringing down ample amount of machinery, and that is what you are witnessing in the market at the moment and nothing else. If you're bringing down something through HS codes, those are restricted, and only export companies are able to bring in equipment, and import companies which are essential to keep up the work that is going on in the country.
If I may add to that, Shamir, another factor that led to this was the fact that the currency was held artificially at $200.
Yeah.
So naturally, I mean, importers also realized that this is an unsustainable position, so they stocked up. I mean, you can't blame them. I mean,
large companies.
Yeah, I mean, everybody who had the capacity. And what we are seeing in the stores today is what was bought some time ago.
Some time ago, it's not.
And you'll find very soon things going sort of,
So it's likely that as we go along towards end of the year, things will all exhaust.
You need to watch Face the Nation every week. You keep yourself abreast of what's going on, because we discuss these problems day in and week out.
But the thing is, at the lower level, where SMEs are concerned, where they are the engine of growth, not the large companies here. And they are the ones who are part of the development process, because it's horizontally spread out. And they are the ones who are across the country. Now, once they get monies, once they get going, it filters down to other layers as well. So, but I find this is where the frustrating point comes. They are being squeezed to such a level, and even the VAT and everything comes in, and finally the interest rates are the final nail on the coffin. They are in a situation where they simply don't have the means of running businesses. And not only that, as I was talking, they said they are scared to lay off people as well, and so they are keeping the people, and that is escalating costs, because the people are working fraction of or portion of the times that they're supposed to be working. So the cost
But do you know, Indrajit, this year, by the end of this year, the forecast that had been made by international organizations is the fact that Sri Lankans will lose to the tune of approximately 1 million jobs as a result of this financial crisis. So that means that small SMEs that are handling operations need to look at the operations much more prudently and effectively, because at the end of the day, private sector companies have to sustain themselves through profit. And if they do not earn profits, if they're going at a loss, where are they going to find the money?
No, I think this is where the other distinction should come in. In every country where the SMEs are concerned, in particular, the government has been supporting them in different ways. There are development banks and that support them as well. So unless this is there, you can't create this advantage for them to make profits. They on their own make profits in a very selected way. But across the board, if you are talking about
What do you mean by selected way, Indrajit?
You know, there are some small companies, they are doing quite well despite all the negatives, that are circulating. But in general, if you want to have a large SME sector to prosper, there has to be a way in which they have to be taken care of. And the last point is, these people have to rely on government institutions, bureaucracies for various things. And that is, they are at the mercy of them. And this government or the previous government, even Gotabaya Rajapaksa regime, failed to see this point enough. This is where I again go back to Ranasinghe Premadasa's time, where I was an assistant director at the Export Development Board, how he turned things around to get the public sector to do their job.
But now we are talking, so you're basically suggesting that we do need to inject money into the SME sector?
No, it's not injecting money. Okay. You know, even in other countries, private sector has, even large corporations do get government support in different ways. That has to be there. And the other kind of support is remove the obstacles. There are so much of obstacles that are there.
But right now, talk about the practical situation in country. Like, is Sri Lanka in a position where we are able to afford to give these benefits to SMEs? Because right now, when you're looking at it, we are able to procure only a small amount of money that we are even supposed to pay for the debt. So, do you think we are in a position to do that right now?
No, it's not a choice. It's not something where, whether we are able to do it. If we are to get the growth going in some way, we have no choice. It is basically, we have to get these guys off to some kind of start, help them to sustain it, and also remove whatever obstacles possible in the best possible manner, so they can stand on their own. But at the moment, they're at the mercy of the bureaucracy, they're at the mercy of the finances, they're at the mercy of various other economic policies, exchange rate, you name it, because they don't have the capacity and the buffers to take care of these shocks.
Yeah. So speaking about assistance, Raj,
can I just?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Thanks. I'll get back to you.
Sure.
We'll come back to you. Raj, my question is for you. Just coming back to this creators conference, the meeting that was held on Friday. During the presentation made by the central bank governor, one of the factors or the facts that were brought to light was that of Sri Lanka's debt, China is our largest creditor. The data show that 52% of our total debt, China is the #1 creditor, followed by Japan with 19.5% and India with 12%. And the central bank says that financing assurances from our bilateral creditors are required as a prerequisite for this IMF board's adoption of the program. 52%. That's a massive amount. One of the questions that the audience or everyone was had at the end of this creditors conference was, how likely is it that our creditors will heed our requests?
Sure. So I would like to correct something there. The 52% is out of total bilateral and external debt. So if you look at China as a percentage of total foreign currency debt, because I'm limited with the numbers that the government that the creditor presentation has. So they have distincted foreign currency and local currency debt. So if we look at China as a percentage of foreign currency debt, it's around 15%, because ISBs and all still hold the majority, the private bondholders. And when it comes to bilateral negotiations, something that we need to understand is no country is willing to take a haircut, because the reason Sri Lanka is in the current debt crisis is mismanagement, corruption and all of our problems, and no country is willing to put the burden on their taxpayers for Sri Lanka's fault. So it's up to how Sri Lanka negotiates and comes up with a plan to these countries. So it's not just China, and there's also a lack of transparency over the progress. We see a lot of news about India, China on their restructurings, but neither has the Sri Lankan government or those respective governments released a statement on the progress on restructuring. So we don't know across bilateral restructuring negotiations what the progress is, or if there is progress in the first place. This was more of like a creditor update. But what we are yet to see is that what we need to see is that how negotiations take place and how we are able to sell the position of whatever we think is the correct haircut. And one way to go about is that we are hopeful that the IMF program, once the board level agreement and all of that is done, there will be some language on the amount of debt restructuring negotiations that the IMF thinks is feasible for Sri Lanka, and that can be used as a base to carry on these debt restructuring negotiations. But as of now, that is not yet transparent, so we don't know what the IMF thinks, what makes Sri Lanka's debt sustainable.
Also, Raj, asking you about that point now, one of the prerequisites of the IMF in the staff level agreement, what they said was they need creditors to come to the table and talk about debt restructuring. But so far, China has been a little defiant in that. They haven't been very forthcoming in coming to the table and being able to discuss debt restructuring, but they offer more loans to pay off the loans that are there. So do you see this as a reason that the IMF could, and also just to make sure, now we talk about reaching an agreement. We haven't signed an agreement. It's not on paper, it's an official. So that wording is very important to get out of the way. So this 2.9 billion US dollars is not the exact amount that we will get, if I'm not wrong, is it?
So the staff level agreement dictates that. So like looking at previous LOIs, that's how it has been. Whatever is agreed on the staff level agreement usually translates to what is agreed upon. And currently it's hindering on the prior actions and the creditor assurance to sign the board level agreement. Staff level agreement has already been obtained.
So could it be, am I reaching too far if I'm saying that China not being willing to come to the table, could it pose a risk to our agreement with the IMF?
Certainly China, like you said, is one of the largest creditors. It's not 52% as such, and the influence of the largest creditor is massive. But what we are yet to see is that if any creditor rejects and we don't get proper financial assurances, it will hinder progress on the on getting the board level agreement. So we are yet to see, and we don't know. I also see news sources on China's restructuring, on India's restructuring, but I haven't seen a statement by the Ministry of Finance of Sri Lanka, or the financial advisors to Sri Lanka, or the Chinese government, or any other country's government as such, where they said this is what we are negotiating, or this is what the negotiations are. So we are yet to see those progresses as well, and until then it's really hard to comment on it.
And also, Raj, like one of the fears that most Sri Lankans have is that our assets are on the line when it comes to paying off debt. And it seems like in most cases we are not able to pay off these debts even if we manage to restructure. There is huge doubt, even if IMF comes in, that we'll be able to pay this debt. So most people are worried about assets being on the line. For example, the ports, the Trincomalee, the oil farm and all that. So we are worried that India, China and possibly even Japan would ultimately make a claim or bring this to the table. Is there a possibility of us going that far? Do you think it is a likely scenario?
So it's a matter. So then that comes again back to how we negotiate.
Yeah.
We need to be able to, like I said earlier, no country, in an ideal scenario, no country wants to take a haircut.
Yeah.
And if they are taking a haircut, they want a good deal. And what Sri Lanka needs and what the country needs is we need to restructure our debt such that the debt becomes sustainable and we are able to repay. So it's a matter of how data-driven our analysis is, because numbers speak better than just pure sentiment.
Yeah.
And I think we need to advocate for that data-driven analysis to see what are the level of haircuts we can take, what level of haircuts can we do, if the level of haircuts work with those countries as well. So we are yet to see those progress, and likelihood is that towards the second to third quarter of 2023, we might get more details on those negotiations.
So, because we are talking about Chinese debt, a point that was brought forward by Shehan as well as Disal a short while ago, I just want to talk about the debt restructuring involving the African nations as far as China is concerned. China has come up with a big handout, a haircut of approximately 3.4 billion US dollars to the African nations. And if I can quip a statement that was made by the Chinese ambassador to Zambia, he says, a gift from the Chinese government to our Zambian friends. Will Sri Lanka also witness such a statement from the Chinese ambassador in Sri Lanka in the near future when it comes to debt restructuring? Because initially China was not open for debt restructuring in the country, but then we saw several statements that were made by the Chinese ambassador to Sri Lanka saying that they're willing to look at options for the island nation, and that is a positive note. But would we see something very concrete in terms of a significant haircut in debt as far as China is concerned?
So again, with Chinese debt, I think Sri Lanka is quite different from the African nations, and we are in the low middle income country range compared to like what African countries are, and I think it's significantly different from Zambia. And it also matters like how Zambia does their debt restructuring negotiations, what are the terms they've agreed on is quite ambiguous. And also with Sri Lanka, we're likely to see some of these news coming up on the restructurings towards, like I said earlier, the second quarter or the third quarter of 2023, once the board level agreement is quite satisfied, once the board level agreement has been achieved on.
So I want to drag your attention to the World Bank STAR program, because when I asked you about a question about accountability, Raj, you said it's very important to take accountability as far as Sri Lanka is concerned, because at the end of the day, accountability is all about making sure that the stolen assets of Sri Lankans are brought back. And what the STAR program does is, it's a stolen asset recovery initiative in partnership between the World Bank and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime that supports international efforts to end safe havens for corrupt funds. So this was one of the ethos, or this was one of the driving slogans at the Aragale as well: bring back our stolen money. Will we see this happening with programs like the World Bank STAR program?
So what's interesting is that for the very first time, what's different with IMF is two things in our program. This year was the year when IMF has declared that Sri Lanka's debt is unsustainable. Usually when we go into IMF programs, Sri Lanka's debt was quite sustainable. The second thing that's different is IMF for the very first time has put language in the staff level agreement to address corruption vulnerabilities. And IMF has been in other countries has asked for various things in terms of corruption vulnerabilities, including asset declaration of public officials. So the STAR program is something that the government has to write to the World Bank, asking for that initiative to be started here. And it was also, I think, in the 2015 to 19, that period, we also announced the Stolen Asset Recovery Task Force that was announced, and that was again dismantled once the new presidential election came in. So we could potentially see it, and that's something that will, I think, enhance the social legitimacy and durability of the program. So currently everyone's eyes is on, like you said, the IMF program. Earlier when we used to enter into the IMF program, the public would not consider as much as they do now. People are watching what Sri Lanka is doing, and getting these corruption vulnerabilities sorted will ensure that the program is socially accepted by the public. Because corruption, like you said, in the Aragale is one of the biggest things that was brought up. And also it will ensure durability. So it will prevent Sri Lanka from possibly getting into another IMF program in 5 years to 6 years' time.
Right. So one of the issues that I brought forward earlier was about the import restrictions. The first import restriction happened to come in the year 2020 on the 16th of April, and subsequently we've seen subsequent import bans being put forward by respective governors of the central bank. So what is important right now is to understand what is going to happen in the next few months. What is the glimmer of hope we have? What is the year 2023 budget going to look like? And what should it look like, in your opinion?
I said at the beginning, I'm not very optimistic for two reasons. One is, as I've been saying, that the strategy that we are adopting here is more about cutting our various things to suit a particular target, which is the debt restructuring and so on and so forth, which is quite necessary. But the knock-on effect of that is that you are sacrificing the growth potential of the economy to a very large extent. You know, it's really curtailing the SME sectors and also the domestic demand, all that. The second point is, I think this is beyond Sri Lanka. There's a global tsunami taking place. Now, as you could see here, whatever said and done, the Ukrainian war is having its real share on the rest of the world, and it is going across the European countries, and as the situation gets worse with winter, things are going to be far more dramatic. And what is happening in the US with interest rates rising now 3.5%, and they are forecasting to the end of the year 4.4%. So that means these are not good signs, these are real bad signs. And when the global system has a particular order, particular way in which things are happening, when things get out of that, you know, it's completely going haywire, then the predictability becomes very difficult. So for a country like Sri Lanka, which is very small and in such bad situation, we don't have any buffers to keep us away from these situations. So this is why I find, I don't want to be pessimistic, but I just can't be optimistic, having seen what is going on around us and within us.
When everyone was pessimistic about the country's economy, Indrajit, you were very optimistic.
Yes, let me tell you why.
Now you are, when something seems to be happening, you are now being...
No, the optimism is this way. We had a very bad scenario and we have come out of it. There is an optimism there. And
so that has to be,
that is definitely a case.
Yeah.
That's definitely a case.
Commended.
But that situation is not a normal situation. That's a shock. I mean, we are getting out of the shock, and the central bank is also doing certain activities in a very technical way, not in a haphazard way, at least that happened in the past. And at least, you know, doing, but from a policy perspective, from a conceptual perspective, I have my reservations as to what is going on and the focus, whether it is on the right direction and right path. This is where my concerns are.
2023 budget. Manjula, I'm very well aware that the chamber is now collecting and furnishing a report to be submitted to the government with regard to your observations and what needs to be included in the 2023 budget. What is your plans, or what are your plans on this as far as Premier Chamber of Sri Lanka is concerned?
Yeah, what we would expect is, of course, a pro-reform budget, because we have to make sure that, you know, this reform program goes through. So we would like to see the revenue proposals come through. The mini budget did not clearly spell them out, but we believe the revenue proposals will.
So you also believe that the interim budget was not the not a very analytical way forward for Sri Lanka?
It had many gaps. I mean, it did signal the government's intent on certain directions, but you know, it obviously, you know, didn't have the substance one would expect in a budget. So we actually, this is where I would again respectfully deviate a bit from Indrajit's position, where I wouldn't expect it to be a growth-oriented budget. See, you can't get to that growth stage all at once. You know, you have to first create a macroeconomic environment which is conducive to growth, right? So we have to first get there. What I mean by that is, I mean, we have to bring down the interest rates. But how do you do that? You have to generate more revenue to the government, because if the government is short of revenue, it has no option other than to go and borrow. And when they try to borrow without printing money, then the interest rates have to go up. So these issues have to be addressed. right? And once you address them, once you get the revenue up, once you get the expenditure down, and maybe also generate some revenue, the certain public enterprises need to be reformed. I think there are few businesses the government can very easily get out of and bring in some revenue to the much depleted coffers of the government. I mean, there are things they can do, right? I mean, so once you do that, and then you bring down the interest rates, you create more stability in the economy, then I think we can start looking at growth. I mean, this is for us in business, it's nothing new, right? Because businesses go through these kind of cyclical periods. I mean, there are times when you go into a very difficult phase.
There's never a calm ocean.
Absolutely, and in such a period, I mean, sometimes we don't think of a growth at that time. All we want is survive. Just make sure that we fix the problems. So maybe 1 year might go by without any growth, right? And then you create the platform to back again start pursuing growth. So I think we are at a stage where we cannot start thinking of growth right now, right? Without addressing the macroeconomic variables. I mean, with inflation running at 60%, 70%, how can you think of growth? You can't. You have to fix those, and to fix those, you need the reforms.
But don't you think, Manjula, the central bank governor is a little bit optimistic with regard to the primary balance that he's talking about, 2.3%. That's very, very optimistic, and that seems like a objective that cannot be achieved, and it looks very much good only on paper.
It's very challenging. It's an absolutely tough target.
5 to 6 times since 1960 we've recorded a positive primary surplus. So now is a very difficult situation. It's dire economic straits that we're talking about, and the governor seems to be very optimistic.
I would say it is not unachievable, right? I mean, if you have the intent, and I must commend the government for showing the kind of intent that we lacked in the past. I mean, if you look at some of the policy decisions taken in the recent last few months, for example, these kind of tax increases, the tariff increases on fuel, on electricity, we have never seen that kind of a sharp adjustment in water. I mean, so that has indicated that the government is willing to take certain unpopular measures. And also, I think you can see, I mean, you hear some noises of protest, but by and large, the majority of the public also is beginning to realize that some of these things are unavoidable.
Yeah, but
right. So if we stay on just let me finish. If we stay on that path, if after a few months things become a little better and everybody starts feeling complacent and everybody starts feeling okay, this is fine, okay, let's abandon the whole program as we had done so many times in the past, and again get back to our old ways. Yes, I mean, we are never going to achieve this, but if we stay on the path and if we show the same intent that we have shown in the last few months, it can be done.
So, Manjula, shivers went down my spine when I saw my electricity bill and my water bill, which has significantly gone up. And as soon as I held my electricity bill and my water bill just a couple of days ago, that was on Friday, what was lingering on my mind was, if I am thinking twice to pay this bill, what would an ordinary person think? A person who is earning daily wages, what will he think? What will the normal person who is on the road trying to sell some vegetables to find ends meal think? That was lingering on my mind, and I was trying to figure out, what can we even do about it? Can we do anything about it?
It's very unfortunate that it had to happen this way. I mean, why it had to happen this way is because we did not keep reviewing, we did not keep revising tariffs over the years. Actually, what we are seeing today is a reasonable price. but it is looking unreasonable because of the sharpness of the adjustment. Why take electricity?
Not on one front, but many fronts.
Yeah, but on most of those fronts, if you take electricity, for how long have we had a tariff revision? And even today, as of today, if you compare with some of our neighboring countries, our prices are not too high.
But then, Mr. Manjula, also I think it's important to point out that these government institutions, they do bleed out a lot. For example, Sipetco, when IOC is making profit, Sipetco is making loss during a time when they should make tremendous profits. But then, talking about making unpopular decisions, it seems that the government is taking it on the people and not restructuring these, these state enterprises, like for example, the CEB and the Sipetco state enterprise. So, do you think like they should rather look at that to stop the bleeding out of money than like first of all taking it out of the people?
No, that has to happen definitely, Disha, no questions about it. But it's just that such a program will take some time, right, for that to show results. Okay, so what you had to do in the immediate time horizon was to make these adjustments to the prices. But definitely the liberalization has to happen, and I believe the government has made signaled its intent to do so, right? Because in some of these areas, maybe all you need to do is just liberalize the market, open it to competition. I mean,
like
let more
now
companies.
They are realizing that CEBs open up for tenders and all that. Now they are realizing.
Unbundle the CEB, allow others to come in to certain segments, maybe power generation,
look at individuals to bring down even fuel. Power should be privatized,
But I think your point is that this going to markets is one way of looking at trying to competition, but then sometimes it doesn't work because then it creates one or two monopolies basically run the whole show. I think what is really necessary is at the moment it's a racket. There's no government. Government is not representing people. What the government does is it in connivance with those bureaucrats and the organizations are looking for rent seeking. This is what has been happening.
You're saying the current president is spearheading a racket?
What is it?
The current president is spearheading a racket?
No, you're misquoting it. I never talked about current president.
You just said the current government
is not president.
Is represented by president.
No, listen, government is not president. Government is a body which represent people, and the president is just the custodian of it, And I guess as an executive president, he should put his foot down and get these guys.
You said you were the assistant director of the investment promotion bureau, right?
No, export development.
Export development. At that time, Ranil Wickremesinghe was the minister of education of that government.
I can't remember Ranil, but I do remember President Premadasa because he intervened in such a way, and where he really turned around these organizations which was looking so lethargic, so indifferent to people, to having something where they were responding to the exporters' needs very well. I want to tell you something else.
Right now, we are not in a state of mind as a nation to think about what went wrong in the past. Now we are in a state of mind as a nation to look at what is in store for us in the future.
I mean, that's always the case.
And
that's always the case.
Isn't that what individuals like you, Manjula and Raj, must have a public discourse about?
I think that's exactly.
Talking about the past is not going to help us. But what can happen is we can use those experiences. They say, if yesterday was a challenge, today is a battle, tomorrow will be an incredible experience. So use that battle, use those challenges that we faced as a nation, and now look ahead, isn't it?
No, Shamir, that's literature. Now, the past matters because past tells you what has worked and what has not worked. So the past is not just to sort of throw away and saying that it's now gone. Past is the experience. Now, what I'm quoting is the two incidents where the past has distinctly worked in a way that has been helpful.
Right.
And I was trying to tell you something else about the primary balance you were talking about. The primary balance has a big deal. Now 2015, I go back to 2015, and that's the closest I have.
I don't know what's with 2000.
No, the point is this, but that's a real case study. Because 2015 to 2019, ideologically, we were following a more freer trade policy.
More democratic.
And we were focused on with
more
IMF.
more democratic.
More democratic, yes, definitely. But of course, they should have been far more democratic, and that's a different story. The second point is they were with the IMF and they were promoting this budgetary balance, and we've got a primary balance. Dr. Harsha was talking about, boasting about, okay, there is a primary balance we got. But what did we get on the other areas? We had one of the worst growth rates. We had the worst trade balance. Those are the real stuff for an economy. This is the problem. This is what I'm trying to draw attention to. I think we should focus on the real meat, not the surrounding dishes here and there. I think that is where the real problem is. Then the last thing is,
but Indrajit, just for our viewers to understand, do you know the growth rate in China?
When?
2022 projected growth rate.
2022, I think they are having a growth rate less than what was predicted earlier.
So
it's a slowing down. It's slowing down.
It's 2.3%.
Yeah.
So as nations, it's not the number that matters, but the level of productivity that is brought forward to the table.
If you have productivity, that is reflected by growth. You get growth where people get productive and people bring investments, people drive sectors. So that is how the growth comes. Productivity is not just it's something in isolation. I mean, in economics, when we are teaching, we talk of productivity as a separate definition. But what really matters from a private sector point of view is productivity is, how best you work and how much you keep on improving that. And the productivity comes not only because of your effort, how the support the government gives to you as well.
Yeah, Indrajit, we've heard economists now in A-level economics. I did accounts for commerce for A-levels, and we were told when money is being printed, inflation goes up. But there was a time that this governor, the former governor, and a few others went on to say that however much money is printed, inflation will not go up.
No, I think the difference, you have to make a difference here. Yeah. Economics is not a gospel truth. Yeah. If you talk to two different economies, they have two different points of view. Leave that aside.
You have to take what economists say with a pinch of salt.
No, the printing money issue distinctly have two different thought waves. Two different.
So let's leave that thought.
But the point is, it's printing money. It's not an open tap.
Yeah. So
that is where the things go wrong.
So let's leave that thought wave aside. What I have learned today, one good thing that I have learned from economists is, Indrajit, you know what? Take whatever economists say with a pinch of salt.
I mean, everybody's that's the way it goes. Yeah, economists definitely, yes.
Because
definitely, we are talk economists.
Yeah, right. So, Raj, tell me a little about, praise me a little about us about the country's budget 2023. What are your expectations?
So, my expectations for the budget is hopefully we'll have the ones that were announced for October would be done by the end of the month, and then in November we're hoping to see new revenue proposals coming in, hopefully, and that have some sort of analysis behind them that gives us targets. In addition to that, like you said earlier, the electricity bill and the inflation is affecting the poor, so we're hoping to see some sort of social security package or some sort of social welfare program for the poor. This was announced in the interim budget as well, and my deepest concern there is that the government is trying to do this through the Samurdhi system, and Weighty research from the policy group has come out and said Samurdhi, and this has also been well researched, where you've seen a lot of papers that said Samurdhi is a very ineffective way of targeting the poor. Roughly around 22% of the money allocated for Samurdhi goes for administrative Samurdhi Niyamakas, and we only target around 41% of the poorest decile. These are just numbers. While something that's coming up now is the electricity pricing. While if you just use a criteria like 60 kilowatts, anyone who consumes less than 60 kilowatts is poor. If you do some sort of targeting like that, you're able to target 81% of the poorest decile.
Right.
The advantage there is that with Samudra, you need to wait for the household income expenditure survey to come out. You have outdated information. You have 2019 numbers, and like I said, poverty line has grown above 60%. With electricity pricing, every month you have the electricity bill, you have registered numbers that you can track, and you can sort of give it with the electricity bill itself, like a coupon that they can cash out. So we need to come up with effective targeting. Social welfare and social safety nets are quite important.
Social welfare is something articulated by the IMF as well.
Exactly, yeah, because one thing that I've seen narratives about some time back is that IMF would come in and cut down expenditure and it's going to affect the poor. It could be true some time back, but with the staff level agreement, we see that IMF wants to have some sort of social safety net for the poor. And they're trying to safeguard the poor, and they're trying to build revenue to match your expenditure rather than cutting your expenditure. So what we need now is better targeting of the poor, and one way of doing that is through electricity targeting.
Right. Any questions, Shahan?
No, thank you.
Right. This all right, super. So we're going for a short commercial break. When we come back, it's the final round. We would love to listen to the final thoughts of the three speakers who we have invited today. Raj Prabhu, Manjul De Silva and Indrajit Aponso to understand what they think about the country's economy and also the way forward. Can at least the 2023 budget make you rich? Stay connected, stay with Face the Nation. We will be back with all this and more.
COVID-19 සඳහා ආරක්ෂිත පියවර. ජනයා වැඩි වශයෙන් සිටින ස්ථානයන්හි ගැවසීම මගහරින්න. රෝගය ආසාදිත පුද්ගලයන් හමුවීමට නොයන්න. මුහුණ, මුඛය, නාසය සහ ඇස් ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න. අනවශ්‍ය ගමන් බිමන් යෑමෙන් වළකින්න. මුඛාවරණය ඉදිරිපස ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න.
කතාවයි ක්‍රියාවයි අතර වෙනස අහවර නොවන මෙහෙවර ජාතික මෙහෙවර
මේ තියෙන කෘෂිකර්මාන්තයේ ප්‍රශ්න
පහුණාට කමක් නැහැ ගොවිතැන් කරන්න අපි වන්දි දෙනවා වී වල ඉහළ මිලක් දෙනවා ලෝකෙ නැති කතන්දර හිටපු ඇමතිවරු කිව්වා
ලෝකෙ කිසි රටක කෘෂිකර්මාන්තය අඩාල වෙලා නැහැ චීනය ජපානය වගේ රටවල ගොයියට සහන ක්‍රම දීලා ගොයියා ගොවිතැනෙන් ගලවගෙන තියෙනවා
ඔබේ ආගම රට මේක තිබ්බොත් ඔබ ජීවත් වේ අපි බොහෝ දේවල් ක්‍රියාවට නැංගිය යුතු කාලය ලැබිලා තියෙනවා
හැම කෙනෙකුටම පුළුවන් ටුවරිසම් වලට දායක වෙන්න. ගා වටේට මුහුද තියෙනවා. ලංකාවේ කිසිම තැනක විදේශිකයෙකුට කන්න සී ෆුඩ් එකක් නැහැ.
වැඩකට ඇති කතාබහක ඉඩකඩ සතිය දිනවල උදෑසන 10:00ට TV1 ඔස්සේ.
Welcome back. This is Face the Nation. We are in the final round, almost hitting 12 midnight. Let's start off the final round with Raj Prabhu, Senior Research Analyst. Raj, what is the way forward for Sri Lanka? And will at least 2023 make you rich?
So the way forward for Sri Lanka is we need to ask the government and also ask the question ourselves. What is the government doing differently than what it has been doing for the past 50 years? Temporary solutions are not going to fix, and we had 16 IMF programs and we have completed around 7 of them. So if you look at the 54-year period from 1965 to 2019, 28 years we've been part of an IMF program. So that's roughly around 50% of that 54 years of being in an IMF program. We need to ensure that this is at least the last, or at least we don't get into this some sort of a crisis. So the question is, what are we going to do differently this year that we have not been doing in the past? And one way of tackling that is basically saying that actions without analysis got into this mess. And actions with analysis is the only way out. And what we need to strive forward is we are hoping that the government will focus on this and have more analysis and have more transparency on that analysis in the upcoming budget. The next year would be a bit difficult, but there could be significant progress. For example, the board level agreement and the debt restructuring negotiations. But based on the government's projections, next year will also be a negative GDP growth. It will be a contraction, not as bad as this year, hopefully. But there are a lot of ifs and buts that the government needs to do to achieve those targets as well. Because all of these targets, and history speaks that government has the ability of setting really optimistic targets and not meeting them. So what is different? What is it going to be this year that we're going to do different? Hopefully the annual budget will have answers to those.
So it won't make you rich next year, that's for sure.
We never know. The budget will tell you.
Thank you very much, Raj, for your thoughts. I now move my attention to Indrajit Aponzo, a senior lecturer, University of Colombo, director of eConsult Asia. What are your final thoughts? What is the way forward?
My final
Certainly 2023 is not going to make you rich, would it?
Well, I don't think anyone will will be rich in 2022, but at least if you survive, that in itself is something to feel good about, right?
Yeah.
But that aside, I think what is necessary for us to look forward to is there is a huge focus on debt restructuring, financial markets. Let that go in one direction. But there are so many other institutions, government institutions, SMEs. I think we should get them to, at least within these constraints, to do their best. We are just left things to their own devices and thinking that when the atmosphere comes right, everything will come right. That won't happen. What is fundamentally necessary is you have to get every bit going and get everyone to function. At the moment, if you go to any government organization, I have just did a few analysis. Even hotlines are totally cold. Web pages are not functioning. Why can't somebody look into those little things as well, leave alone other matters? Now that shows the indifference we have with regard to the rest of the institutions in this country. They should also shoulder responsibility. They should also carry the burden and the accountability to get this going. Then the private sector guys who are on their own, especially the SMEs, they need support in whatever the way. Doesn't have to be cash, but they need support. At least don't get them to go through all the hassle and the difficulties getting things done. At least those who survive will have hope of doing something. Unless we have these parallel processes going, I think we are not looking very good for the next 2 or 3 years.
Thank you very much, Indrajit. I now move my attention, last but not the least, Manjul De Silva, CEO of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce.
Shamir, what I feel is I think we should stay on this track. I think we have finally got on to the right track. We have understood what is ailing us, and we seem to be moving in the right direction. In particular with the IMF program, contrary to what I think a lot of people are trying to make out it to be, I think we heard many kind of statements being made that the IMF will become a worse remedy than the problem itself. But I mean, just look at the program. I'll just quote very quickly from the program itself. I mean, what are the objectives we are talking about? Are these harmful to us? So I would invite the public to just take a independent, unbiased view of what we have agreed to do together with the IMF. So we talk about revenue-based fiscal consolidation, cost recovery-based energy pricing, stronger social safety net to protect the most vulnerable. As Raj said some time back, people are saying IMF reforms will place an additional burden on the poor, but here they are putting that, emphasizing on the social safety net. Public debt management strategy, restoring public debt sustainability, restoring price stability, rebuilding international reserves, greater exchange rate flexibility, right? And if that happens, won't that help exports? I mean, that's the most valuable incentive an exporter can have is to have a realistic exchange rate, which they did not enjoy in the past and often had to work within an overvalued exchange rate. And then commitment to greater central bank independence and to phase out monetary financing, which is a nicer way of saying stop money printing. Policies to safeguard financial system stability, focused reforms to address governance and corruption vulnerabilities. So these are the things the public have been asking for, and this is exactly what the IMF is echoing as well. And finally, broader structural reforms to unlock Sri Lanka's growth potential. And that includes SOE reforms, labour reforms, capital market reforms. There are so many areas where reforms are needed. My only worry is not actually this program itself, but whether we will be able to stay on course, because past records don't say much about our ability to do that, and whether, you know, when things become a little better, like most patients do, when they start feeling a little better, whether they will, you know, stop taking the medicine and you know, just taking it easy, and then as a result, you know, not getting the best out of the program. But if we do, I don't think in 2023 we can become richer, we can probably become less poorer, right? But 24 onwards, I think we can hope for a brighter future if we stick to this program.
Thank you very much, Manjula. When you spoke about the IMF, I felt that you looked at me, but you were actually looking onto your left when you were saying it. Thank you very much, Raj Prabhu, Senior Research Analyst of Veritiv, joining us this evening on the show. Manjula De Silva, Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, Chief Executive Officer. Thank you very much, Manjula. And of course, Indrajit Aponzo, a Senior Lecturer at University of Colombo, for joining us this evening. It was wonderful to have the two of you. And the debutant, of course, Raj, for joining us this evening. We'll probably hear a lot from you later on for the years to come and also the months ahead. Thank you very much, Shahan. Thank you very much, Disal, for joining us this evening on the show. I leave you tonight with a quote, as I always do. Just a few thoughts to the government. Creditors have better memories than debtors. So some food for thought for the government while they take a good night's sleep and think ahead as far as the months and years ahead are supposed to unfold right before our eyes. Take care and good night.